The ASSA 700 is a Swedish pin tumbler lock which was first manufactured in 1948. It has undergone several iterations since its release, starting with hourglass drivers, then all tapered drivers, and finally a mix of tapered, gin, and Christmas tree drivers with complementary countermilling. This is the lock that we will be examining in this video. There are two different types of pin pairings in the ASSA 700. Standard key pins with tapered drivers and torpedo key pins with either gin spools or Christmas tree drivers. There are 7 heights for each key pin and 3 heights for each driver. The gin driver is 5 mm and the Christmas tree driver is either 6 or 7 mm. This is how the standard key pins are matched with the tapered drivers. And this is how the torpedo key pins are matched with the gin spool or Christmas tree drivers. The smallest key pin here is a standard key pin and not a torpedo. The pin pairs are arranged in the lock in a predictable manner. Pin chambers 3, 5, and 7 have standard key pins matched with tapered drivers, and pin chambers 1, 2, 4, and 6 have torpedo key pins matched with either gin spool or Christmas tree drivers. These chambers also have complementary countermilling. Let's take a closer look at those gin and Christmas tree drivers. We have previously discussed how to pick gin spool drivers in video 21. For an in-depth explanation, I would highly recommend that you watch this video. However, as a quick review, there are 4 phases in picking the gin spool drivers. They are: number 1, setting the gin into the countermilling. 2, unlocking the head of the gin from the countermilling by float picking. 3, clearing the shear line. And 4, differentiating the feedback of a set pin from a pin in the countermilling. The Christmas tree driver is a gin spool driver that has a spooled section cut out of it. This causes the Christmas tree driver to have 3 distinct segments. Each segment will have its own characteristic behavior until that segment crosses over the shear line. The first segment of the Christmas tree behaves as a standard driver. Once the driver is lifted to this point, it behaves like a spool entering a deep false set. Constant pick pressure will result in typical auto rotation of a spool driver without the need for manual counter rotation, also known as float picking, that a gin spool requires, although manual counter rotation may still be implemented. As the driver passes this point, it falls into another false set and must be picked like a gin spool with manual counter rotation. Let's take another look and see how the 7 key pins are paired with either gin spool or Christmas tree drivers. If we install them individually into a cutaway, we can make a composite photo and better analyze their behavior. This photo demonstrates the position of the shear line and the countermilling relative to the drivers in their resting position. These pins can be grouped into 4 behavior types, which I will label A, B, C, and D. Let's take a look at each group in turn to see how they behave. Group A are Christmas tree drivers that have their topmost standard section at shear when in the resting position. They will go through all 3 segments that we have previously discussed. The standard section is easily picked and a nice click is heard. The plug then enters a false set. Constant pick pressure will cause auto counter rotation of the plug as it enters a second false set. The plug is now manually counter rotated by float picking as the pick is bounced on the key pin until a sudden increase in springiness is felt, which signifies that the gin section of the Christmas tree has cleared the shear line and may be set. Group B are Christmas tree drivers that have their spooled section at shear when in the resting position. The driver starts off in a false set and can be auto counter rotated as the spooled section is set. It will then enter a second false set as the gin segment enters the countermilling. The gin is then float picked by manually counter rotating the plug as the pick is bounced on the key pin. The sudden increase in springiness is felt and the driver is then set. Group C is a gin spool driver that has its gin head on the bottom of the countermilling when in the resting position. It will act as a typical gin spool driver. It starts out in a false set. The pick is then bounced on the key pin, and the gin head will be felt moving within the countermilling. A sudden increase in this movement signifies that it has cleared the shear line and the driver is set. Finally, Group D is a gin spool driver that has its gin head at the top of the countermilling when in the resting position. Therefore, it cannot travel the length of the countermilling when bounced. This causes this pin to have a unique type of feedback. As the pick is bounced on the key pin, there is no movement or springiness within the countermilling. As the plug is further manually counter-rotated, the typical increase in springiness is felt, which signifies that the shear line has been cleared and the driver is set. The difference between Group C and D and their feedback may be easier to understand if we see a side-by-side comparison. Gin C is on the left, which starts at the bottom of the countermilling at rest and has full travel within the countermilling when the pick is bounced. Gin D, on the other hand, is on the right, which starts at the top of the countermilling at rest and has limited travel within the countermilling when the pick is bounced. During the float picking phase, Gin C will feel springy in its travel through the countermilling, while Gin D will not. We have previously discussed how to pick tapered drivers in video 23. To summarize, the three most important tips are: number 1, use heavy tension. 2, keep gently nudging each key pin up in small increments. And 3, watch out for oversetting pins. Standard key pins with tapered drivers are found in chambers 3, 5, and 7 in the ASSA 700. It is not uncommon to find a standard driver pin or a torpedo key pin in chamber 7. Since the ASSA 700 only has either 2 or 3 tapered drivers installed, they will be relatively easy to pick. The tapered drivers are usually the first to bind in the lock. Okay, let's get to picking. The ASSA 700 has no sidebar, so true float picking must be implemented. Therefore, I'm going to be using 2 tension wrenches so I can have fine control over the rotation and counter rotation of the plug. I'm going to start off by zipping the plug, and I can feel that there's a speed bump on number 3. It's binding, and so I'm going to click that and pick it first. 5, 7, nice click out of 5. Now 7 is set, and we're in a false set. Driver 4 is a Christmas tree. I'm bouncing my pick as I'm manually counter-rotating until I feel increased springiness, and I set driver 4. Next is driver 6, a gin driver. I'm bouncing my pick while manually counter-rotating, feeling for that release from the countermilling, and now 6 is set. Now number 1 is a Group D gin, so there is no springiness with counter-rotation, just a click, which signifies that it is set. I'm now working on a gin in chamber 2. Bouncing and floating, bouncing and floating. Now that's set. I'm now going back to 6. That feels set. Now 4. That's set. Sometimes you have to pick these multiple times because they ping pong, one will drop the other. Going back to 2. Bouncing that pick, manually counter rotating. That feels set. Now back to number 1. Nice click, and we're open. All right, let's get this guy out of the vise. What is the one thing that I hate about the ASSA 700? The C-clip. I actually cut this one down, and I'm still having a hard time removing it. I do want to thank Legend of the Samurai for grub screwing my 700. I'm going to take the pins at the top. First one is a gin. It's a Group D gin with no travel. Number 2 is a Group C gin. Number 3 is a tapered driver. Number 4 is a Christmas tree. Number 5 is a tapered driver. Number 6 is another Group C gin. And finally, 7 is a standard driver with a torpedo key pin. Let's take a look now at the plug and its countermilling in chambers 1, 2, 4, and 6. Those are the chambers with either the gins or the Christmas tree drivers. And here are all the pins. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one.